This is my woodworking project with the African hardwood Padauk. I'm making some training weapons for a Filipino martial art that I train in, and have been making weapons in various hardwoods, mostly for the fun of it. What you see here is a planer, so I'm just making the wood flat and thinning it down to the thickness that I prefer. I can tell you right now that this will end up being 0.68 inches thick. So I'm making this in Padauk, an African hardwood, whereas beforehand, the last one I used was tiger wood, and before that I'd started with a regular red oak from Home Depot. So the first step is I get the wood to size and measure it because the machine is very precise. Then I need to measure the actual sides. Like I said, the machine is very precise down to the thousandth of an inch. So side to side is not as important, but the cutting tool going deep is important. I need it to go barely through the wood itself, which I'll get to later. The work table you can actually see it on the corner to the left of the screen, is the shop bot, which is what will be cutting it. To hold the wood down on the work table, I put screws in the corners, and I'll set it up so that the head will miss the screws. So this is how I do that. In a vector program known as Adobe Illustrator, I have the things I want to cut, and I have them set up in a way inside of a square the exact same size as the wood, with little circles showing where the screws are. This way I know that the cutting head, the end mill, will miss the screws. There's two sets of lines because that is the width of the end mill itself. Once that's done, we can move on to getting the ShopBot set up. This is a ShopBot Buddy at Tech Shop in Chandler. I had a couple problems. I hadn't used this in a long time, so it was taking me longer than usual to get it set up. And I accidentally saved it to the next option down. Saving it to the right file type is very important, so I'm going to skip ahead because it took me a long time to get it set up and everything put together. Once I do start, I do a quick pass at maybe 10 times the normal speed of what it's actually going to cut and let it just float above the wood. This is my final check to make sure that I'm not going to hit the screws and I'm not going to go outside of the piece of wood, that I've zeroed the axes correctly. If it does hit a screw, the screw will pop out of the wood, everything will turn and move, and it's just terrible. So when you're done getting everything zeroed, everything set, I've triple checked, then the cutting starts. This is a time lapse because the cut itself took about 40 minutes. And during the 40 minutes that it's cutting, I'm not allowed to leave. I have an emergency stop button because when something goes wrong fast. And you have to be there with emergency stop. So what do you do while you're sitting for 40 minutes while this is just cutting over and over again? Well, I stare at it, and to make sure that it's cutting correctly, I can't help but use the vacuum and get all the dust out of the way. It's very important not to get my hands underneath that black stuff that you see on the side. It's suctioning a lot of the sawdust out itself, but yeah. Oh, there's a little thumbs up. So it cuts okay. The wood is very slightly bowed, so in some places it didn't cut all the way through, and in others it did even more so. You'll notice that I put it down on cardboard. That's so I can tell the program to cut through the wood slightly, and I'm not going to cut into the table. If you cut into the table itself, they charge you money. So since it didn't cut all the way through, I have to take it to the bandsaw and kind of finish cutting it out. Some of them will fall out, some of them won't. Sometimes I gotta cut it a little bit more than others. There you go, just like that, it just fell out. If I pull it out of the wood, then sometimes it'll tear off a piece of the wood and it looks like there's a gouge in the sword. So I keep cutting them off, It's held into the wood by little pieces of wood the program puts in where I tell it to, called tabs. This is so that once it's done cutting a knife, in this case, it won't just fly off. You have two little pieces of wood. So I cut those, and if there's anything left over, I take that out as well. So once I'm done on the bandsaw, those tabs are still kind of sticking out. So I sand those off on the belt sander. Doesn't take very long. Once we're done sanding off the tabs and anything else I think doesn't look nice, we move over to the table router. Table router's fun, getting your fingers really close to something. This Padauk, this hardwood is very bright orange and just powders your fingers and the whole area. So I frequently stop for the sake of everyone else I'm sharing the wood shop with and get that dust out of the way. Although I cannot help at some point but have a little fun. You'll notice that my shirt is brown. It's going to change to black here in a second. That's because the wood router was having a problem and I needed to come back the next day. Oh, Kenpo for life. Once I'm done routing everything, and since the wood is bowed, the router doesn't look super pretty because sometimes it's right on point and the curve is beautiful and sometimes it's a little bit off. So once I'm done with the router, the next is to sand it. I have 3 steps in sanding because I have bought 3 different grits of sandpaper. Remember, the lower the number, the rougher it is. So I have 120 grit, and that's what I start to fix any small mistakes. If the table router cut into a little more than I expected, so on and so forth, then I start with 120, go up to 220, and then I finish off with 400, and the 400 just looks beautiful. Sanding it puts this almost, it's like rubbing Cheetos all over your hands. It gives your hands a bright orange feel. I leave right here to go to the belt sander so that I can take a couple pieces off that I just can't get with that sandpaper. So this sanding for all the 2 swords, 4 knives, takes about another 40 minutes. Oh man, that just looks terrible. It washes off really easy though. Most of it does. So the last step after sanding it is to put on your finish. I'm using a boiled linseed oil. It looks nice, and with the sanding you can feel the wood when you're holding it, and it looks really nice. The greatest part about it is that it darkens the wood and gives it a deeper, richer color. The bright orange becomes kind of a deep sort of blood orange, maybe a reddish color, which you'll see in a second. And once it's the quickest step. So here's the finished product. 2 swords, 4 knives. They're darker because they were left in my car and the wood darkens in sunlight, but otherwise that is my whole project.